The gunshot split the calm dawn air like thunder, sending a flock of startled birds into the sky as Elizabeth Adams ran for her life across the dusty plains of Wyoming Territory. 1875. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the hem of her once fine dress torn and caked with dirt as she fled from the men who had murdered her father. Behind her, hoofbeats pounded the earth, growing louder by the second. "You can't run forever, missy." A gruff voice called out, followed by mocking laughter. "Your pa's debts are now yours to pay." Elizabeth's auburn hair had come loose from its pins, streaming behind her as she pushed her exhausted body forward. 3 days on the run had left her weak and disoriented, but the memory of her father's blood pooling on the floor of their modest homestead kept her moving. They had killed him over gambling debts, debts she hadn't even known existed until these men had shown up at their door. The trees ahead offered her only hope. If she could reach the forest, perhaps she could lose them in the dense woodland. Her lungs burned as she pushed herself harder, the distance to the tree line seeming impossibly far. The riders were gaining. She could hear the snorting of their horses, the jingle of spurs. 50 yards to the trees. 40. 30. A rope whistled through the air, catching her around the waist and yanking her backward with brutal force. Elizabeth crashed to the ground, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. Stars danced before her eyes as rough hands seized her arms, dragging her to her feet. "Thought you'd get away, did you?" The man who held her was bearded and foul-smelling, his yellowed teeth bared in a grin. "Bixby don't like folks who try to run from what they owe." "I don't have any money," Elizabeth gasped, struggling against his grip. "Everything my father had was in that house." "Then you'll work off the debt," another man said, dismounting from his horse. He was better dressed than the others, with a black vest and a silver watch chain. "One way or another." "No," Elizabeth said, fighting back tears. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "I won't." The man in the vest stepped closer, grabbing her chin. "You don't have a choice, girl." A hard blow to the side of her head sent her spiraling into darkness. When Elizabeth awoke, she found herself in near complete darkness. Her head throbbed painfully where she'd been struck, and her mouth was dry as cotton. Slowly, she pushed herself up from the dirt floor, trying to make sense of her surroundings. She was in some sort of shed or outbuilding. No windows broke the rough wooden walls, and only thin slivers of light penetrated through the gaps in the boards. The air was stale and thick with dust. A single door, secured from the outside, was the only way in or out. Elizabeth staggered to her feet, swaying slightly as dizziness washed over her. She pressed her hands against the door, then her shoulder, pushing with all her might. It didn't budge. "Help!" she called out, her voice cracking. "Someone help me!" Only silence answered her. Panic rose in her chest as she pounded on the door, her fists striking the unyielding wood until her knuckles bled. Eventually, exhaustion overtook her, and she slid down to the floor, her back against the door. Hours passed, or perhaps days. It was impossible to tell in the unchanging darkness. Thirst clawed at her throat and hunger gnawed at her belly. Occasionally, she heard voices outside, men talking and laughing, but they ignored her pleas for water, for food, for mercy. Elizabeth tried to stay strong, tried to maintain hope, but as time wore on, despair began to creep in. Was this how she would die, forgotten in a shed, slowly wasting away? She thought of her father, of the life they'd built after her mother died, of the small joys they'd shared despite their hardships. She would not give up. She could not. Somehow she would survive this. On what she estimated was the 3rd day of her imprisonment, Elizabeth heard the approach of a horse. Different from the others, a steady, unhurried rhythm. The sound stopped near the shed, followed by the creak of saddle leather as someone dismounted. "Who's out there?" She called, her voice barely above a whisper due to her parched throat. Footsteps approached the door, then paused. A moment later, a man's voice, low and cautious. "Is someone in there, please?" Elizabeth croaked, pressing closer to the door. "Help me." "Stand back from the door," the voice instructed. Elizabeth scrambled backward, hope flaring in her chest for the first time in days. There was a series of solid thuds against the door, wood splintering under heavy impacts. Suddenly, the door burst inward, light flooding the small space and temporarily blinding her. Squinting against the brightness, Elizabeth made out the silhouette of a tall man framed in the doorway. As her eyes adjusted, details emerged: broad shoulders beneath a worn leather vest, a bandana around his neck, and a weathered cowboy hat shadowing his face. "Dear God," the man murmured, taking in her condition. He stepped inside, crouching down beside her. "How long have you been in here?" "3 days, I think," Elizabeth whispered. "They took me, after they killed my father." The man's jaw tightened. He reached for something at his belt, a canteen, and offered it to her. "Small sips," he cautioned as she grabbed for it desperately. "Too much at once will make you sick." The water was warm and tasted faintly of metal, but to Elizabeth, it was sweeter than the finest wine. She forced herself to drink slowly, though every instinct screamed at her to gulp it down. "Thank you," she managed after slaking her initial thirst. "Who are you?" "Name's Nathan Keller," he replied, his voice a deep rumble. "I was passing through, heard what sounded like someone in trouble." He looked around the shed, his expression darkening. "Who did this to you?" "Men who claimed my father owed them money. Their leader's name is Bixby." Recognition flashed in Nathan's eyes. "Floyd Bixby, the loan shark," Elizabeth nodded weakly. "Do you know him?" "Know of him. Nothing good." Nathan reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a bundle wrapped in cloth. "Here, it's just bread and some dried beef, but it's something." Elizabeth's hands trembled as she accepted the food, forcing herself again to eat slowly despite her ravenous hunger. As she ate, she studied her rescuer. Nathan Keller was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps in his late 20s. His face was tanned and weathered from life outdoors, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble. His eyes, a clear gray blue, watched her with concern. "We need to get you out of here," he said, glancing toward the door. "Bixby and his men could be back any time." "Where would I go?" Elizabeth asked, the reality of her situation hitting her anew. "My home is probably ransacked by now, if not burned to the ground." "I've got a place," Nathan said after a moment's hesitation. "It's a small ranch about a day's ride from here. You can stay there until you're back on your feet." Elizabeth studied him warily. Experience had taught her to be cautious of seemingly generous offers from strangers, especially men. "Why would you help me?" A shadow passed over Nathan's features. "Let's just say I've seen what Bixby does to people who cross him. Nobody deserves that." He stood up, offering her his hand. "Can you walk?" "I think so." Elizabeth took his hand, letting him help her to her feet. Her legs wobbled beneath her, weak from days without food and minimal movement in the confined space. "Easy now," Nathan said, steadying her with a hand at her elbow. "We'll take it slow." Outside the shed, the late afternoon sun nearly blinded Elizabeth. She blinked rapidly, tears streaming from her light, sensitive eyes as she took in her surroundings for the first time. They were at what appeared to be an abandoned way station, a derelict building standing a short distance from the shed. A chestnut horse with a white blaze stood ground-tied nearby, occasionally swishing its tail at flies. "That's Thunder," Nathan said, nodding toward the horse. "He's strong enough to carry us both until we can find you a mount of your own." Elizabeth nodded, trying to gather her strength. "Where are we?" "About 20 miles southwest of Medicine Bow. Bixby uses this place sometimes when he doesn't want to be found." Nathan led her toward his horse. Can you ride? Or would you prefer I help you up front? Pried Ward with practicality in Elizabeth's mind. In her weakened state, she wasn't sure she could stay mounted on her own. I think together might be safer, at least until I've regained some strength. Nathan nodded, not making her feel any worse about her admission. He helped her onto Thunder, then swung up behind her with practiced ease. His presence at her back was solid and reassuring as he reached around her for the reins. "We'll ride until nightfall, then make camp," he said. "There's a creek about 10 miles from here where we can rest safely." As they set off at a steady pace, Elizabeth found herself leaning back against Nathan's chest, her exhausted body seeking support. Despite her wariness, there was something about this quiet, serious cowboy that made her feel secure for the first time since her father's murder. "Thank you," she murmured, her eyelids growing heavy as the rhythmic motion of the horse lulled her toward sleep. "For the bread. For breaking down the door. For saving my life." "Get some rest, Miss Adams," Nathan replied softly. "You're safe now." As Elizabeth drifted into an exhausted slumber, she couldn't know that their journey together was just beginning, or that the man whose strong arms now kept her from falling would soon mean more to her than she could possibly imagine. They rode until the sky began to darken, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and purple over the distant mountains. Elizabeth drifted in and out of consciousness, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion and deprivation of the past days. Each time she woke, she found herself still securely held in Nathan's arms, his steady presence a bulwark against her fears. As promised, they stopped at a small creek nestled in a stand of cottonwoods. Nathan dismounted first, then reached up to help Elizabeth down. Her legs nearly buckled as her feet touched the ground, and he caught her before she could fall. "Easy there," he said, his voice gentle. "Let's get you settled." With efficient movements born of long practice, Nathan set up a small camp. He spread a bedroll near the fire he built, helped Elizabeth to sit, and then set about preparing a simple meal of beans, more of the dried beef and coffee. "It's not much," he said apologetically as he handed her a tin plate, "but it's hot and filling." "It's wonderful," Elizabeth replied sincerely, savoring each bite. After days of nothing, the simple fare tasted like a feast fit for royalty. "I can't thank you enough, Mr. Keller." "Nathan," he corrected, settling across from her with his own plate. "No need for formalities out here." Elizabeth nodded, studying him in the firelight. There was a quietness about him that spoke of a man comfortable with solitude, yet his actions toward her had been nothing but kind and considerate. "Nathan, then," she agreed. "And I'm Elizabeth. Elizabeth Adams." "Elizabeth," he repeated, as if testing the name. "How did you come to be in Bixby's clutches, if you don't mind my asking?" she sighed, setting down her empty plate. "My father and I had a small homestead north of Laramie. We weren't wealthy, but we managed. After my mother died of fever 5 years ago, it was just the two of us." Elizabeth paused, the grief still fresh. "3 days ago, these men rode up, said my father owed Bixby money from gambling debts. I didn't even know he gambled." Nathan's expression darkened. "Bixby's known for getting men drunk, rigging card games, then collecting with interest." "They shot him," Elizabeth said, her voice breaking. "Right in front of me. When I ran, they came after me. I thought I could reach town, find the sheriff, but—" She gestured helplessly. "They caught me before I could." "I'm sorry about your father," Nathan said quietly. "No one should have to witness something like that." Elizabeth wiped away a tear with the back of her hand. "What about you? You seem to know a lot about Bixby." A muscle in Nathan's jaw tightened. "Let's just say our paths have crossed before. Nothing good comes from getting involved with men like him." "Yet here you are, helping me escape from him," Elizabeth pointed out. "Aren't you worried about the risk?" Nathan poured himself more coffee, the firelight catching on a small scar that ran along his jawline. "I've been taking risks most of my life, Elizabeth. Some are worth taking." His words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning she couldn't fully decipher. There was history there, she was certain, a story he wasn't ready to tell. "You should rest," he said, changing the subject. "We've got a long ride tomorrow." Elizabeth didn't argue. Despite the food and water reviving her somewhat, exhaustion still pulled at her limbs like lead weights. Nathan helped her settle onto the bedroll, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the night's chill. "What about you?" she asked, noticing there was only the one bedroll. "I'll keep watch for a while," he replied, checking his revolver before returning it to his holster. "Get some sleep, Elizabeth. You're safe." As she drifted off, Elizabeth found herself believing him, this stranger who had appeared like an answer to her desperate prayers. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight she was safe from Bixby's men, from hunger and thirst, from the suffocating darkness of that shed. She slept deeply, dreamlessly, for the first time in days. The dawn came with a gentle touch of pink and gold across the eastern sky. Elizabeth awoke to the smell of coffee and the quiet sounds of Nathan moving around the camp. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. Where was she? Why was she sleeping outside, before the events of the previous day rushed back? She sat up slowly, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles and the persistent ache in her head where she'd been struck. Nathan glanced over at her movement, offering a nod in greeting. "Morning," he said, pouring coffee into a tin cup. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Elizabeth replied, accepting the cup gratefully. "Still a bit weak, but better." "There's a pool just around that bend," Nathan said, gesturing downstream. "Private enough if you want to wash up. I've laid out some soap and a clean shirt of mine." "It'll be too big, but fresher than what you're wearing." Elizabeth felt a rush of gratitude at his thoughtfulness. After days in the shed, she was acutely aware of her disheveled state. "Thank you, I won't be long." The cool water of the creek was revitalizing as Elizabeth washed away the grime and sweat of her captivity. The soap was rough but effective, and she scrubbed until her skin felt raw and clean. Nathan's shirt, as predicted, hung on her like a tent, but she rolled up the sleeves and belted it with a strip of fabric torn from her ruined dress. When she returned to camp, Nathan had packed most of their things and was saddling Thunder. He glanced up at her approach, and something in his expression shifted, a momentary softening around his eyes before he returned to his task. "You look more yourself," he said simply. "I feel more myself," she replied, running her fingers through her damp hair. Without a brush, the best she could do was braid it loosely to keep it from tangling during the ride. They ate a quick breakfast of hardtack and jerky, then mounted up as the sun cleared the horizon. Like the previous day, Nathan seated Elizabeth in front of him, though she felt strong enough to ride on her own if necessary. "How far is your ranch?" she asked as they set off at a steady trot. "About 15 miles as the crow flies," Nathan replied. "But we'll take a less direct route, just to be safe. Bixby's bound to be looking for you by now." The thought sent a chill through Elizabeth despite the morning warmth. "What will happen when he realizes I'm gone?" "He'll be angry," Nathan said matter-of-factly. "But the territory's big, and Bixby's got other concerns besides one escaped captive. If we're careful, we can stay ahead of him." They rode in companionable silence for a time, the landscape unfolding before them in rolling hills dotted with sagebrush, and the occasional stand of cottonwoods marking a water source. Despite the circumstances, Elizabeth found herself appreciating the wild beauty of Wyoming Territory. She'd rarely ventured far from their homestead and never in this direction. "Have you lived out here long?" she asked eventually, curious about her rescuer. Going on 5 years, Nathan replied. Came west after the war. Worked cattle drives for a while, then as a ranch hand until I saved enough to buy my own place. You fought in the war? Elizabeth asked, turning slightly to see his face. A shadow crossed Nathan's features. Union cavalry, joined up in '63, fought till Appomattox. My father fought too, Elizabeth said softly. He didn't talk about it much. Most don't, Nathan agreed, his tone making it clear he preferred not to elaborate. Elizabeth respected his reticence. Many men who had survived the terrible conflict preferred to leave those memories buried. Instead, she asked about his ranch, and was rewarded with more animated responses as Nathan described the small but sturdy cabin he'd built, the spring-fed creek that ran through his property, and the small herd of cattle he was slowly building. It's not much compared to some of the big spreads, he admitted, but it's mine. No one can take it from me. There was pride in his voice, and something else of fierce independence that Elizabeth recognized from her own father. Homesteaders and small ranchers had to be self-reliant to survive in these territories, where nature and man alike presented constant challenges. Around midday, they stopped to rest thunder and eat a light meal. Nathan seemed increasingly vigilant, his eyes scanning the horizon frequently as they sat in the shade of a large boulder. Is something wrong? Elizabeth asked, noticing his tension. Nathan frowned slightly. Not sure, just a feeling. He stood, climbing partway up the boulder to get a better view of the surrounding terrain. After a moment, he swore softly. What is it? Elizabeth asked, alarm rising in her chest. Riders, Nathan said grimly, sliding back down. 4 of them coming from the east. Could be innocent travelers, but more likely Bixby's men, Elizabeth finished, her heart pounding. Nathan nodded, already gathering their things. We need to move. Now. They mounted quickly, Nathan urging Thunder into a gallop as soon as they were settled. Elizabeth clung to the saddle horn, fear giving her strength as they raced across the open terrain. Nathan steered them toward a line of hills, where the landscape offered more cover. How did they find us so quickly? Elizabeth asked, raising her voice to be heard over the thunder of hooves. They know this territory, Nathan replied grimly. And they're motivated. Bixby doesn't take kindly to losing what he considers his property. The implications of his words made Elizabeth shudder. What would have happened to her if Nathan hadn't found her when he did? What fate had Bixby planned once she was broken by hunger and thirst? Thunder was a strong horse, but carrying double weight limited his speed and endurance. The riders behind them were gaining ground, their shouts now audible on the wind. There. Nathan pointed toward a narrow canyon cutting through the hills ahead. If we can reach that, we might lose them. Elizabeth held on tighter as Nathan pushed Thunder harder, the faithful horse responding with a burst of speed. They reached the mouth of the canyon just as a gunshot cracked behind them, the bullet kicking up dirt 20 feet to their right. Keep your head down, Nathan ordered, drawing his own revolver as they plunged into the relative shelter of the canyon. The path narrowed quickly, forcing them to slow to a trot. The high walls provided cover from gunfire, but also limited their options for escape. Nathan guided Thunder through the twisting passage with the confidence of someone who had traveled this route before. There's a fork ahead, he said, his voice low near her ear. The left path leads to a dead end. The right eventually opens onto a plateau with several possible routes down. They might split up to cover both paths, Elizabeth pointed out. Nathan nodded. That's what I'm counting on. It'll divide their strength. As they reached the fork, Nathan made a split-second decision. Instead of taking either path, he guided Thunder into a narrow crevice between 2 large boulders that partly concealed a third option, a steep, treacherous game trail that switchbacked up the canyon wall. "Hang on tight," he warned as Thunder picked his way carefully up the dangerous path. Elizabeth held her breath, acutely aware that a single misstep could send them tumbling down the rocky slope. Behind them, she heard the pursuers reach the fork, their voices echoing up from below as they argued over which path to take. "Two of them are taking the right fork," Nathan murmured, his keen ears picking up their plans. "The others are going left. They haven't spotted the trail we're on." They continued their precarious climb until they reached a small ledge about halfway up the canyon wall, hidden from view from below by an outcropping of rock. Nathan dismounted, helping Elizabeth down before leading Thunder deeper into the natural shelter. "We'll wait here until they give up searching," he explained, keeping his voice low. "The canyon amplifies sound. They'll hear us if we try to continue now." Elizabeth nodded, trying to control her ragged breathing and hammering heart. The ledge was barely 6 feet deep, and perhaps 15 feet long, a tight space for 2 people and a horse, but adequate as a temporary hiding place. Time seemed to crawl as they huddled on the ledge, listening to the occasional shouts of the searchers below. Thunder stood quietly, as if understanding the need for silence. Nathan remained vigilant, his revolver ready, his body positioned protectively between Elizabeth and the path they'd ascended. "Who are you really?" Elizabeth whispered after a long silence. "You're not just a rancher, are you?" Nathan glanced at her, then back toward the canyon below. "I was a scout for the Army after the war," he admitted. "Spent 2 years tracking renegades and outlaws across 4 territories before I settled down." That explained his tracking skills and his confidence in this rugged terrain. "Is that how you knew about this place? This hidden trail?" He nodded. "Chased a band of horse thieves through here in '68, nearly broke my neck on this same path." A faint smile touched his lips. "Never thought I'd be using it again." "I'm glad you remembered it," Elizabeth said sincerely. Hours passed, the sun beginning its westward descent as they waited. Gradually, the sounds from below diminished until only the natural noises of the canyon remained: the whisper of wind, the occasional call of a bird, the soft shifting of Thunder's hooves on the rocky ledge. "I think they've moved on," Nathan said finally, after listening intently for several minutes. "But we'll stay put until dark, just to be safe." As the afternoon waned, they shared the last of Nathan's jerky and water, sitting side by side with their backs against the canyon wall. Despite the danger they'd just escaped, Elizabeth found herself oddly at peace in this moment of quiet companionship. "Thank you," she said suddenly, turning to face Nathan. "Not just for rescuing me from the shed, but for risking your life to keep me safe from Bixby." Nathan met her gaze, his blue-gray eyes serious. "You don't need to thank me for doing what's right, Elizabeth." "Nevertheless, I am grateful," she insisted. "Most men would have left me to my fate once they realized Bixby was involved." Something flickered in Nathan's expression, a mixture of pain and resolve. "I've seen what happens when good people look the other way," he said quietly. "I won't be that man. Not again." Elizabeth sensed there was a story there, perhaps connected to his obvious hatred of Bixby, but she didn't press. Instead, she reached out impulsively, placing her hand over his where it rested on his knee. "Well, I'm glad you're the man you are, Nathan Keller." His hand turned beneath hers, their fingers intertwining briefly before he withdrew, standing to check Thunder and peer cautiously over the edge of their hiding place. "The sun's almost down," he said, his voice slightly rougher than before. "We should be able to move soon." As darkness fell, they carefully made their way down from the ledge, leading Thunder on foot along the treacherous path until they reached the canyon floor. Nathan scouted ahead briefly before returning to report that there was no sign of Bixby's men. "We'll head northwest from here," he decided. "It's a longer route to the ranch, but less likely to be watched." They rode through the night, staying off the main trails and keeping to the shadows. Elizabeth, exhausted by the day's events, found herself dozing against Nathan's chest as they traveled, his arm secure around her waist to keep her from falling. It was nearing dawn when Nathan finally reined Thunder to a stop atop a small rise. "There it is," he said softly, his breath warm against Elizabeth's ear. "Home." Through the pre-dawn light, Elizabeth could make out a small cabin nestled against a backdrop of pine trees, a corral and small barn beside it. A creek glinted silver in the growing light, winding through the property before disappearing into a stand of cottonwoods. It was modest, as Nathan had said, but even in the dim light, she could see it was well-maintained, a true home, not just a shelter. "It's lovely," she said sincerely. "It's safe," Nathan replied, urging Thunder forward. "And that's what matters right now." As they approached the cabin, Elizabeth felt a curious mixture of relief and apprehension. She was safe from Bixby for the moment, but what would happen next? Her home was gone, her father dead, her future uncertain. And this man who had saved her, this quiet, honorable cowboy with secrets in his eyes, was still largely a mystery to her. Yet as Nathan helped her dismount in front of the cabin, his hands strong and steady at her waist, Elizabeth felt something else too, the first fragile stirrings of hope. The cabin was exactly as Nathan had described, small but solid, built with care and attention to detail. Inside, Elizabeth found a single room divided by function. A cooking area with a cast iron stove, a table with 2 chairs, a bed against the far wall, and a stone fireplace that would provide warmth in winter. "It's not much," Nathan said, watching her take in her surroundings. "But it's dry and warm." "It's wonderful," Elizabeth replied honestly. After the darkness of the shed and nights spent on the hard ground, the cabin seemed like luxury. Nathan busied himself lighting the stove and preparing a more substantial meal than they'd had on the trail: bacon, biscuits from a tin, and strong coffee. Elizabeth sat at the table, fatigue washing over her now that the immediate danger had passed. "You can take the bed," Nathan said, setting a plate in front of her. "I'll sleep in the barn." "I couldn't put you out of your own bed," Elizabeth protested. "You're not putting me out of anything," he countered. "I've slept in worse places than my own barn." Too tired to argue further, Elizabeth nodded gratefully. They ate in companionable silence, the simple food tasting better than any feast she could remember. Afterward, Nathan showed her where he kept clean linens and offered her privacy to wash up using water heated on the stove. "I need to tend to Thunder and check the perimeter," he explained, gathering his rifle. "Take your time. Get some rest." Alone in the cabin, Elizabeth washed away the dust of their journey, changed into a clean shirt Nathan had left for her, and finally allowed herself to truly relax. The bed, though simple, felt like heaven after her ordeal. She was asleep within moments of lying down, not even hearing Nathan return to check on her before he retreated to the barn as promised. Elizabeth slept through most of the day, waking only when late afternoon sunlight streamed through the cabin's windows. She sat up slowly, momentarily disoriented before remembering where she was. The cabin was empty, but a note on the table caught her attention. "Gone hunting. Stay inside. Back by sunset." She used the time alone to explore the cabin more thoroughly, finding it remarkably well organized for a bachelor's dwelling. Books lined a small shelf: history, a few novels, practical guides to ranching and animal husbandry. A trunk at the foot of the bed contained clothing and, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, a military uniform with cavalry insignia. In a drawer of the small desk, Elizabeth found a daguerreotype of a young woman with a serious expression, wearing the fashion of a decade past. She wondered who the woman was to Nathan, a sweetheart, perhaps, or a sister. There was a resemblance in the shape of the eyes, but Elizabeth couldn't be certain. True to his word, Nathan returned as the sun was setting, a brace of rabbits in hand. He seemed pleased to find Elizabeth up and about, though he raised an eyebrow at the books she'd been perusing. "Hope you don't mind," she said. "I was curious about my host." "Not much to learn from my books," Nathan replied with a small smile, "but you're welcome to them. It'll be a few days before it's safe to take you to town." The mention of town brought Elizabeth's situation into sharp focus again. "What will I do then?" she asked quietly. "I have no family, no home to return to." Nathan set about preparing the rabbits for cooking, his hands deft with the knife. "There are options," he said carefully. "Medicine Bow's growing. They need teachers, seamstresses. Or there's a stage that runs to Cheyenne twice a month, bigger city, more opportunities there." Elizabeth nodded, though neither option appealed much. She'd never been to a city larger than Laramie, and the thought of starting over alone in a strange place was daunting. "For now," Nathan continued, "you're welcome to stay here, at least until Bixby's men stop looking for you. You don't think they'll check here?" Elizabeth asked, suddenly concerned that she was bringing danger to his doorstep. Nathan's expression hardened slightly. "Let them try. This land is registered under a different name. Bixby doesn't know about this place, and none of his men would recognize me from my scouting days." His confidence was reassuring, but Elizabeth couldn't help wondering what history lay between Nathan and Bixby. The animosity seemed too personal for a mere dislike of the man's methods. As they prepared and ate dinner together, Elizabeth found herself studying Nathan when he wasn't looking. There was a quiet strength to him, a self-contained quality that suggested he was accustomed to solitude. Yet he moved around her with a natural courtesy, anticipating her needs without being intrusive. "Tell me about your life before," Nathan said suddenly, as they sat before the fire after dinner. "Not the bad parts, the good ones." Surprised by the request, Elizabeth gathered her thoughts. "We had a small farm near Laramie," she began. "Nothing grand, some chickens, a vegetable garden, a cow for milk. My mother loved flowers, though. She planted wildflowers everywhere, said they reminded her of home back east." As she spoke, memories surfaced: her mother singing as she kneaded bread, her father teaching her to ride their old mare, family dinners around their modest table. Simple joys that now seemed precious beyond measure. "After Mother died, Father and I managed as best we could. I took over the household duties. He taught me to shoot, said a woman alone needs to defend herself." Elizabeth smiled sadly at the memory. "He didn't approve of gambling, at least not that I knew. I still can't understand how he got involved with Bixby." Nathan stared into the fire, his expression somber. "Bixby has ways of drawing people in. He seems friendly at first, offers loans with reasonable terms, hosts games that seem fair. By the time people realize they're caught in his web, it's too late." The bitterness in his tone prompted Elizabeth to ask, "You speak from experience?" For a long moment, Nathan was silent, and Elizabeth thought he might not answer. Then, with eyes still fixed on the dancing flames, he began to speak. "I had a brother, younger than me by 2 years, Noah, smart as a whip but restless. When I came west after the war, he followed a year later." Nathan's voice was steady, but Elizabeth could hear the pain beneath the words. "While I was away scouting, he fell in with Bixby's crowd, started gambling, borrowing money." Elizabeth's heart sank, guessing where this story was heading. "By the time I returned, he was in deep. I tried to help, offered to sell my stake in a mining claim to pay his debts. But Bixby wasn't interested in money anymore. He wanted Noah to work for him, collecting debts from others. Nathan's jaw tightened. Noah refused. They beat him so badly he never woke up. "Oh, Nathan," Elizabeth whispered, instinctively reaching out to touch his arm. "I'm so sorry." He acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod. "I went after Bixby, of course, nearly got myself killed. A friend pulled me out of there, convinced me that getting myself shot wouldn't bring Noah back. So you bought this place instead, eventually. Took time to cool my head, save enough money. But I never forgot." Nathan finally looked at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "When I found you in that shed, it was like seeing Noah all over again, another of Bixby's victims. I couldn't walk away." The revelation of Nathan's past explained so much: his hatred of Bixby, his willingness to risk himself for a stranger, the shadows that sometimes darkened his gaze. Elizabeth felt honored by his trust in sharing this story, understanding what it must have cost him to revisit those memories. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly, "and thank you again for saving me." Nathan held her gaze for a moment longer, something unspoken passing between them before he looked away. "It's getting late," he said, rising to his feet. "You should get some rest. I'll check the perimeter once more before turning in." As he moved toward the door, Elizabeth called after him. "Nathan," he paused, looking back at her. "You don't have to sleep in the barn. This is your home. I can make a pallet by the fire." He shook his head, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "My mother raised me better than that, Elizabeth. The barn's comfortable enough." With that, he was gone, leaving Elizabeth alone with the crackling fire and her thoughts. Sleep came more slowly that night, her mind filled with images of Nathan, his story of loss, and the growing awareness that her feelings for this solitary cowboy were becoming more complicated by the hour. Days passed in a rhythm that grew increasingly comfortable. Nathan taught Elizabeth about the daily routines of the ranch, feeding the small herd of cattle, tending the vegetable garden behind the cabin, repairing fences, and caring for Thunder and the 2 other horses in his modest stable. She proved a quick learner, eager to contribute rather than merely be a guest. In the evenings, they would sit before the fire, talking long into the night. Elizabeth learned that Nathan had grown up in Pennsylvania, the son of a blacksmith who had taught him both that trade and a love of books. Nathan, in turn, discovered that Elizabeth had a sharp mind and a gift for storytelling, often keeping him entertained with tales from the few books she had read or stories her mother had told her as a child. A week after her arrival, Elizabeth was hanging laundry to dry when she noticed Nathan watching her from the corral, where he'd been breaking a young Mustang. There was something in his expression that made her heart quicken a warmth, an appreciation that went beyond mere friendship. He approached as she finished her task, wiping sweat from his brow with a bandana. "You've taken to ranch life well," he observed. Elizabeth smiled, oddly pleased by his approval. "It's not so different from the farm, really, just larger scale." Still, not every city-raised woman would adapt so easily. "I wasn't raised in the city," she corrected. "We lived in a small town in Ohio before coming west, and my mother made sure I knew how to work with my hands." Nathan nodded, his eyes lingering on her face. In the week since her rescue, Elizabeth had regained her strength, her complexion returning to its natural healthy glow. Her auburn hair, once lank from her captivity, now shone in the sunlight as it escaped from her practical braid. "I'm heading to check the north pasture," Nathan said. "Would you like to come along? It would do you good to get beyond the immediate property." Elizabeth readily agreed, eager for a change of scenery after being confined to the cabin and yard. Nathan saddled Thunder for her and took his other mount, a sturdy black gelding named Shadow, for himself. They rode at a leisurely pace, Nathan pointing out landmarks and boundaries as they went. The day was perfect clear blue sky, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of sage and pine, wildflowers dotting the grassland in bursts of color. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth said as they paused atop a rise overlooking a verdant valley. "Your own little kingdom." Nathan smiled, more relaxed than she'd yet seen him. "Hardly a kingdom, but it's peaceful. Sometimes I ride out here just to think." "What do you think about?" Elizabeth asked, genuinely curious. He considered the question seriously. "The future, mostly. What I want this place to become. What I'm working toward." "And what is that?" Nathan's eyes scanned the horizon before returning to meet hers. "A real home. Not just a place to sleep and work, but somewhere with purpose, meaning." Something in his tone made Elizabeth wonder if he was speaking of more than just the physical ranch. Before she could question him further, however, a movement in the distance caught his attention. "Riders," he said, his posture instantly alert, "coming up from the south." Elizabeth felt a surge of fear. "Bixby's men." Nathan shook his head slowly. "Don't think so. Wrong direction." He studied the approaching riders through narrowed eyes. 3 of them, moving casually, not in a hurry. They watched as the riders drew nearer, following the creek that ran through Nathan's property. As they came into clearer view, Nathan relaxed slightly. "It's Ben Lockhart," he said. "Owns the next ranch over. Good man. The others must be his hands." Elizabeth felt relief wash over her, though she remained wary. After her experience with Bixby, she found it hard to trust strangers. Nathan guided Shadow down the slope toward the approaching riders, gesturing for Elizabeth to follow. As they drew near, the lead rider, a weathered man in his 50s with a salt and pepper beard, raised his hand in greeting. "Keller, thought that might be you up there." "Lockhart," Nathan returned with a nod. "What brings you this far north?" "Lost a few head," the older man replied, his eyes shifting curiously to Elizabeth. "Thought they might have wandered onto your range." "Haven't seen any strays," Nathan said, "but I'll keep an eye out." After a moment's hesitation, he added, "Ben, this is Elizabeth Adams. She's staying with me for a time." "Elizabeth, Ben Lockhart." Elizabeth nodded politely, noting the surprise and interest that flashed across Lockhart's face at the introduction. "Miss Adams," Lockhart said, tipping his hat. "A pleasure. Don't recall Keller here mentioning a lady friend before." "Miss Adams is a family friend," Nathan said smoothly. "Her father recently passed, and she needed a place to stay temporarily." Elizabeth was impressed by how easily the partial truth came to Nathan's lips. It was clear he didn't want to share her real situation with anyone, even a neighbor he seemed to trust. Lockhart nodded sympathetically. "Sorry for your loss, miss. These territories can be hard on folks." "Thank you, Mr. Lockhart," Elizabeth replied. After some further discussion about the missing cattle and local news, Lockhart and his men continued on their way. As they rode out of earshot, Elizabeth turned to Nathan. "You didn't tell him the truth." Nathan shook his head. "The fewer people who know about Bixby's involvement, the safer you'll be. Ben's a good man, but he's got hands who might talk in town." His protectiveness touched Elizabeth, even as she recognized the wisdom in his caution. "How long have you known him?" "Since I bought this place. He helped me get established, taught me a lot about ranching." Nathan smiled slightly. "He's been trying to marry me off to his niece for the past 2 years." "Oh." Elizabeth felt an unexpected twinge of jealousy. "Is she pretty, this niece?" Nathan's smile widened at her poorly concealed interest. "Wouldn't know, never met her. Ben just thinks a man my age should be settled with a wife." "And what do you think?" Elizabeth asked, trying to sound casual. Nathan's expression grew more serious as he studied her. "I think a man should marry when he finds the right woman, not before." Something in his gaze made Elizabeth's cheeks warm, and she looked away, suddenly very interested in adjusting Thunder's reins. "We should head back," she suggested. "It'll be dark soon." They rode home in a silence that was charged with unspoken thoughts and growing awareness. Elizabeth found herself hyper-conscious of Nathan's presence beside her, of the way the setting sun caught the gold in his brown hair, of the strength in his hands as he guided his horse. That night, as they sat before the fire after dinner, the air between them felt different, expectant, filled with possibilities neither had yet dared to voice. Nathan had opened a bottle of whiskey, pouring a small measure for each of them to ward off the evening chill. "Ben's visit got me thinking," Nathan said after a while, "about what happens next." Elizabeth looked up from the shirt she was mending, one of Nathan's that had torn during his work with the Mustang. "What do you mean? You've been here over a week now," he said carefully. "Eventually, we'll need to decide what comes next for you." The thought of leaving sent a pang through Elizabeth's heart. In the short time she'd been at the ranch, it had begun to feel like home in a way she hadn't expected. Or perhaps, she admitted to herself, it was Nathan who made it feel that way. "I suppose I should go to town soon," she said reluctantly. "Find work, a place to stay." Nathan stared into his whiskey, turning the glass slowly in his hands. "Or you could stay." Elizabeth's breath caught. "Stay." "Here? Why not?" Nathan met her gaze, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "You fit here, Elizabeth. You understand this life, this work. And—" He hesitated, then continued more softly, "I've grown accustomed to your company." "Nathan, I know it's sudden," he interrupted, setting down his glass. "We've only known each other a short time, but sometimes life doesn't give us the luxury of a proper courtship." Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest. "Are you proposing?" Nathan stood, moving to kneel before her chair. "I'm saying that I care for you, Elizabeth Adams, more than I expected to, more than I thought I could care for anyone after what happened to Noah." He took her hands in his touch gentle yet strong. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight, just that you consider staying. Consider us." Elizabeth looked into his earnest face, this man who had saved her life, who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect, who made her feel safe in a way she hadn't since before her mother died. The feelings that had been growing within her crystallized in that moment into certainty. "I don't need time to consider," she said softly. "I want to stay, Nathan, with you." Joy broke across his features like sunrise. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Nathan leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. Elizabeth responded with a tentative kiss of her own, her hands moving to rest on his shoulders. When they parted, Nathan rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected to find you," he murmured. "Certainly not in a shed in the middle of nowhere." Elizabeth laughed softly. "Life has strange ways of bringing people together." He kissed her again, more confidently this time, and Elizabeth felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire burning beside them. This was right, she thought. Unexpected, unplanned, but right. Later, as Nathan reluctantly prepared to head to the barn for the night, Elizabeth caught his hand. "Wait." At his questioning look, she explained, "I know we agreed to take things slowly, but I don't want to be alone tonight. Would you stay?" "Just to sleep," she added hastily, not wanting him to misunderstand. Nathan's expression softened with understanding. "The nightmares," Elizabeth nodded. Since her rescue, she'd woken several times from dreams of the shed, of Bixby's men finding her again. "I feel safer when you're near." "Then I'll stay," Nathan said simply. That night, they lay side by side in Nathan's narrow bed, a proper distance between them but close enough that Elizabeth could feel the reassuring warmth of his presence. For the first time since her father's murder, she slept without nightmares, secure in the knowledge that she was no longer alone. The following weeks brought a new rhythm to life at the ranch. With the decision made that Elizabeth would stay, they began to plan for a future together. Nathan rode into town to speak with the local minister about performing a wedding ceremony, returning with not only a date set for the following month, but also supplies, fabric for a new dress for Elizabeth, and a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother. "It's nothing fancy," he apologized as he slipped it onto her finger to check the size. "We can get something better," when Elizabeth silenced him with a kiss. "It's perfect," she assured him. "I couldn't ask for anything more meaningful." They worked side by side during the days, Elizabeth taking over the household duties but also helping with the ranch work when needed. In the evenings, they planned for the future additions to the cabin, improvements to the herd, perhaps even children someday, but shadows still lingered. Elizabeth would sometimes catch Nathan watching the horizon with a vigilant expression, and she knew he was thinking of Bixby. Though they had heard no news of pursuit, the threat remained, a cloud over their newfound happiness. 2 weeks before their planned wedding, Nathan announced that he needed to make a trip to Medicine Bow for additional supplies and to check with his contacts about any news of Bixby's movements. "I'll be gone 3 days at most," he promised, preparing Shadow for the journey. "There's plenty of food, and you know how to handle the rifle if needed. Keep the doors locked at night." Elizabeth nodded, trying to hide her apprehension. It would be the first time they had been separated since her rescue. "Be careful," she said, reaching up to straighten his bandana. "Bixby might have men watching the town." "I'll be careful," Nathan assured her, leaning down from the saddle to kiss her goodbye. "I'll be back before you know it." Elizabeth watched him ride away, a sense of foreboding settling over her despite her efforts to remain positive. She busied herself with chores, determined not to dwell on fears that were likely groundless. The first day passed uneventfully, as did the second. On the third day, Elizabeth was in the garden harvesting vegetables when she heard the approach of horses, multiple riders, coming fast. Her heart leapt, thinking Nathan had returned with company, perhaps Ben Lockhart or the minister. But as she straightened, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, her blood ran cold. 4 riders were approaching, and even at a distance, she recognized the lead horse, a distinctive palomino that had belonged to one of Bixby's men. They had found her. Elizabeth dropped the basket of vegetables and ran for the cabin, her mind racing. How had they discovered her whereabouts? Had Nathan been captured in town? Was he even now being held by Bixby? Or worse, she reached the cabin, slamming and bolting the door behind her. Nathan's rifle hung over the fireplace. She grabbed it, checking that it was loaded as he had taught her. 4 men. 6 shots in the rifle, plus Nathan's revolver in the drawer with additional ammunition. The riders slowed as they approached the cabin, spreading out to surround it. Elizabeth positioned herself at the window, trying to control her trembling hands as she raised the rifle. "Elizabeth Adams." A familiar voice called out the bearded man who had captured her before. "We know you're in there. Come out peaceful-like and nobody needs to get hurt. Go away." Elizabeth shouted back. "This is private property," a laugh. "That cowboy of yours ain't here to protect you, girl." "We've been watching. Saw him ride out days ago, so they had been observing the ranch. But how had they found it in the first place?" Elizabeth's mind raced, trying to understand what had gone wrong. "Bixby wants you back," the man continued. "Says you're unfinished business. But he's willing to be reasonable. Come with us quiet and we'll leave your cowboy alive when he returns." The threat to Nathan hardened Elizabeth's resolve. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she called back. "And I'm not alone. There are hands working the north pasture. They'll be back any minute." A lie, but she hoped it might give them pause. "Nice try," another voice responded, younger with a southern drawl. "Place is deserted except for you. Now we can do this easy or we can burn you out. Your choice." Elizabeth's grip tightened on the rifle. She would not be taken again. would not be locked away in darkness to waste away. Nathan had taught her to shoot, and she would defend her home, their home, with everything she had. When one of the men moved toward the door, Elizabeth fired, the shot splintering the wood of the porch near his feet. He jumped back with a curse. "She's armed," he shouted to the others. "Last chance, girl," the bearded man called. "Next time we won't be so gentle." Elizabeth didn't respond, conserving her ammunition and looking for a clean shot. The men had taken cover behind water troughs, the woodpile, the corner of the barn. They were being cautious, which bought her time, but for what? Nathan wasn't due back until evening at the earliest. One of the men made a dash for the back of the cabin. Elizabeth swung the rifle around, firing through the rear window. She missed, but the shot was close enough to send him scrambling back to cover. "You can't watch all sides at once," one of them taunted. "We can wait you out." He was right. Eventually, they would find a way in, or night would fall, making it harder for her to see them coming. Elizabeth fought down her panic, trying to think strategically as Nathan would. The standoff continued for nearly an hour, with occasional shots exchanged but no clear advantage gained by either side. Elizabeth moved between windows, trying to give the impression that there were indeed multiple defenders inside. Then she smelled smoke. Looking out the front window, she saw one of the men approaching with a burning torch, intending to make good on their threat to burn her out. Elizabeth aimed carefully and fired, the shot catching him in the shoulder. He dropped the torch with a howl of pain, retreating as his companions provided covering fire. But the momentary victory was short-lived. The fallen torch had ignited the dry grass near the porch, and flames were beginning to spread toward the cabin. Trapped between fire and Bixby's men, Elizabeth felt despair threatening to overwhelm her. If only Nathan were here. If only she had insisted on going to town with him. A sudden commotion outside drew her attention. New gunshots, but not directed at the cabin. Shouts of alarm from Bixby's men. Elizabeth risked a glance out the window and saw a rider charging into the yard, gun blazing Nathan. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by fear for his safety. He was outnumbered, exposed. But Nathan rode with the skill of a cavalry veteran, using Shadow's speed and agility to stay ahead of return fire while picking off targets with deadly accuracy. 2 of Bixby's men fell in the initial assault. A third ran for his horse but took a bullet in the leg before he could mount. The bearded leader, seeing his advantage lost, made a desperate break for the trees. Nathan wheeled Shadow around, giving chase. Elizabeth lost sight of them among the pines, then heard 2 more shots in quick succession. Minutes later, Nathan emerged from the trees alone, riding back toward the cabin at a gallop. Elizabeth unbolted the door and ran to meet him as he dismounted, throwing herself into his arms with a sob of relief. "Are you hurt?" Nathan demanded, holding her at arm's length to check for injuries. "Did they touch you?" "No, I'm fine," Elizabeth assured him, clinging to him. But the cabin, the fire, Nathan looked toward the porch where the flames were still spreading. "We need to put that out before it reaches the structure." Together, they worked to extinguish the fire, using blankets and buckets of water from the well. When the immediate danger had passed, Nathan turned his attention to the wounded man, securing him with rope despite his protests and cursing. "Bixby will kill you for this," the man spat as Nathan tightened the bonds. "He don't forgive those who cross him." "Bixby's not going to be a problem anymore," Nathan replied grimly. "Not for us, not for anyone." Elizabeth looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" Nathan straightened, his expression hard. "I went to town for supplies, but also for information. Heard rumors that Bixby was asking questions about a cowboy who might have helped a woman escape. Started putting pieces together too quickly for my comfort." "So what did you do?" Elizabeth asked, already guessing the answer from the determined set of his jaw. I paid him a visit before I left town, Nathan said simply. Made sure he understood that his business with us was finished. The gravity of his words hung in the air between them. Elizabeth didn't need to ask if Bixby was dead. She could read the truth in Nathan's eyes. He had eliminated the threat to their future permanently. The sheriff, she asked quietly, knows nothing, Nathan assured her. Bixby had plenty of enemies, could have been any of them. He glanced at their prisoner. This one and the other survivor will be delivered to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. They're wanted for other crimes. Elizabeth nodded slowly, processing what Nathan had done for her, for them, for their future. She should have been horrified, perhaps, at the violence of it. But all she felt was profound relief and gratitude that this man had gone to such lengths to protect her. You came back early, she said, suddenly realizing he wasn't due until evening. Nathan's expression softened as he drew her close again. Had a feeling, couldn't explain it, just knew I needed to get back to you. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. Thank God I did. As the adrenaline of the confrontation began to fade, Elizabeth felt her legs grow weak. Nathan steadied her, leading her to sit on the porch steps while he secured the prisoners in the barn and checked the property for any remaining threats. When he returned, he sat beside her, taking her hand in his. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Sorry I left you alone, sorry they found us. Elizabeth shook her head. You couldn't have known, and I'm not helpless. I held them off until you arrived. Pride gleamed in Nathan's eyes. That you did. Remind me never to underestimate you, Elizabeth Adams. Soon to be Elizabeth Keller, she reminded him with a small smile. Nathan brought her hand to his lips. The minister's ready whenever we are. After today, I'm thinking the sooner the better. Elizabeth couldn't have agreed more. Tomorrow, she suggested impulsively. Nathan's eyebrows rose in surprise. Tomorrow, what about your dress, the preparations? I don't need a fancy dress or elaborate preparations, Elizabeth said firmly. I just need you, Nathan. The rest is details. His smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. Tomorrow it is, then. The next morning, they rode into town together. Leaving the wounded prisoners secured in the barn with water and food, Nathan was firm that even criminals deserved humane treatment until the marshal could collect them. The small church in Medicine Bow was simple but well-maintained, with sunlight streaming through plain glass windows onto wooden pews. The minister, a kindly older man named Reverend Thomas, welcomed them warmly, not questioning their desire for an immediate ceremony. Elizabeth wore her best dress, not a wedding gown, but a pretty blue calico that Nathan had brought from town on his previous visit. Her hair was arranged simply, adorned with wildflowers she had gathered that morning. Nathan had shaved carefully and donned a clean shirt and vest, his usually unruly hair tamed with water and a comb. They stood before the minister, hands joined, as he led them through the traditional vows. Elizabeth's heart swelled as Nathan promised to love, honor, and protect her for all his days, his voice steady and sure. When it came her turn, she spoke her vows clearly, without hesitation, committing herself to this man who had rescued her from darkness and shown her what true strength and kindness looked like. With this ring I thee wed, Nathan said softly, sliding his mother's gold band onto her finger. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Reverend Thomas declared with a warm smile. You may kiss your bride, Mr. Keller. Nathan cupped Elizabeth's face gently in his hands, his eyes filled with a love that took her breath away. When his lips met hers, she felt as though every hardship, every fear, every moment of despair had been leading her to him, to this life they would build together. After the ceremony, they shared a simple meal at the town's only restaurant before heading back to the ranch. As they rode side by side, now as husband and wife, Elizabeth felt a profound sense of peace. The shadow of Bixby was gone. The future stretched before them, bright with possibility. "What are you thinking?" Nathan asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. Elizabeth smiled, looking at the man who had changed her life in ways she could never have imagined when he broke down that shed door. "I'm thinking that sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best ones. If not for Bixby, I would never have met you." Nathan reached across the space between them to take her hand. "I would have found you somehow," he said with quiet conviction. "Some things are meant to be." As they crested the rise that overlooked their ranch, their home, Elizabeth knew he was right. Their paths had been destined to cross. Two souls marked by loss and hardship finding in each other the strength to begin again. The sun was setting as they approached the cabin, painting the sky in brilliant hues of gold and crimson. Nathan helped Elizabeth dismount, then surprised her by sweeping her into his arms to carry her across the threshold as tradition demanded. "Welcome home, Mrs. Keller," he said softly as he set her down inside. Elizabeth wrapped her arms around his neck, drawing his head down for a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. "Home," she agreed. "At last." 3 years later, Elizabeth stood on the porch of the expanded cabin, watching as Nathan taught their 2-year-old son how to gently pet a new foal. The ranch had prospered under their joint care, growing from a modest homestead to a respectable operation with a growing herd and additional hands to help with the work. Ben Lockhart had become a close friend and staunch ally, eventually introducing Nathan to the niece he'd been trying to match him with for years. She had married one of Nathan's ranch hands, and the four often shared Sunday dinners together. The territorial marshal had taken Bixby's surviving men to face justice for their many crimes. With Bixby himself gone, his operation had crumbled, bringing relief to many who had suffered under his predatory practices. As for Elizabeth and Nathan, their bond had only strengthened with time and trials. The nightmares that had once plagued Elizabeth had faded, replaced by dreams of the future they were building together. "Mama, look," their son called excitedly as the foal nuzzled his small hand. "She likes me." "She certainly does, Noah," Elizabeth replied, smiling at the name they had chosen to honor Nathan's brother, a way of ensuring that his memory lived on in a new generation. Nathan looked up, meeting her gaze across the yard. His eyes still held that same warmth that had first drawn her to him, now deepened by shared joys and sorrows, by the life they had created together. As Elizabeth rested her hand on her swelling abdomen, feeling the first flutters of their second child, she thought back to that dark shed where their story had begun. From captivity to freedom, from despair to hope, from strangers to beloved family, their journey had been unexpected and sometimes dangerous, but she wouldn't change a single step of the path that had led her here. Nathan excused himself from their son, crossing the yard to join her on the porch. "Everything all right?" he asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Elizabeth smiled, leaning into his embrace. "Everything is perfect," she assured him. "I was just thinking about how far we've come." Nathan's arm tightened around her waist as they watched their son giggling at the foal's antics. "And how far we still have to go," he added, his hand coming to rest protectively over hers on her belly. "Together," Elizabeth said, tilting her face up to his. Nathan's kiss was as tender as the first they had shared, yet filled with the deeper understanding that only comes with time and trust. "Always together," he promised. And as the sun set over their land, casting long shadows across the home they had built with love and determination, Elizabeth knew with absolute certainty that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had faced everything else side by side, stronger together than they ever could have been apart.